Milo has apparently decided to join us for story time today, so if you hear a little bit of rumbles in the background, that's him enjoying laying on my arm, putting it to sleep. The Unwanteds by Lisa McMann. Chapter 1, The Purge. There was a hint of wind coming over the top of the stone walls and through the barbed wire sky on the day Alexander Stowe was to be purged. Alex waited in the dusty commons of Quill and felt the light breeze cooling the sweat on his upper lip. His twin brother Aaron stood beside him, their parents behind, and all around the entire community of Quill watched and waited, the bland looks of sleeping fish on their faces. Mr. Stowe pressed his finger hard into Alex's back. A final poke in the kidneys, a last goodbye, Alex thought, or a warning not to run. Alex glanced at Aaron, whose face showed the tiniest emotion. Scared, was it? Or sad? Alex didn't know. The high priest Justine, her long white hair undisturbed despite the breeze, rose to her full height and observed the silent crowd. She began without introduction or ado, for a purge was neither exciting nor boring. It just was, as many things just were in Quill. There were nearly 50 13-year-olds this year. The people of Quill waited to hear which of these teenagers had been marked as wanted or unnecessary, and, by process of elimination, which of them remained to be purged. Alex scanned the group and their families around the giant half-circle of the amphitheater. He knew some of them, not all. Alex's mind wandered as the high priest Justine announced first the names of the Wanteds, and he startled only slightly as the high priest spoke Aaron's name. Aaron, who had nothing to worry about, sighed anyway in relief, which he was among the 15 names called. The necessaries were next. 13 names were read. Alexander Stowe was not one of those either. Even though Alex knew that he was unwanted and had known ever since his parents had told him over breakfast when he was 10, the knowledge and 3 years of preparation weren't enough to stop the sweat that prickled his armpits now. It was down to a mere formality unless there was a surprise, which there was sometimes, but it didn't matter. Everyone stood motionless until the final 20 names were called. Among the unwanted, Alexander Stowe. Alex didn't move, though his heart felt like a cement block into his gut. He stared straight ahead as he'd seen the other unwanteds do in past years. His lip quivered for a moment, but he fought to still it. When the governors came over to him, he put his arms out for them to shackle with rusty iron bands. He made his eyes icy cool before he glanced over his shoulder at his parents, who remained unemotional. His father nodded slightly and finally took his finger out of Alex's back after the shackles were secure. That was a minor relief, but what did it matter now? Aaron snuffled once quickly, catching Alex's attention in the silent amphitheater. The identical boys held a glance for a moment. Something like a jolt of energy passed between them, and then it was gone. "Goodbye," Aaron whispered. Alex swallowed hard, held the stare a second more as the governors tugged him to follow, and then broke the connection and went with the governors to the waiting bus that would take him to his death. Chapter 2, Wanted. Aaron Stowe, the wanted, watched his brother Alex board the rusty box of a bus, and then he turned his eyes to the formidable high priest Justine. She retreated to her aging jeep-like vehicle, flanked by 2 guards and her secretary, and they began the drive up the dusty hill to the palace, leaving a trail of gray smoke and a sharp odor to linger in the heavy air. The rest of Quill slowly dispersed on foot. Murmurs surfaced and drifted through the crowd. Not about the purge, of course. That was already a cloudy memory for some. Instead, they spoke of their plans for the rest of the day, for the day of the purge was Quill's one holiday each year. All of the wanteds and most of the necessaries, except those who tended to the farm animals, were free to do as they pleased for the rest of it. Aaron knew what he would be doing. He turned to his mother and father and said with a decisive air, "All set, then?" Mrs. Stowe nodded primly, and the 3 of them followed the crowd down the dusty path that led to Quadrant 4, where they lived. "We'll finish making your uniform and get your things packed for university," she said. "Cut your hair, too." She looked at Mr. Stowe and asked, "I don't suppose we'll get the unwanted boys' clothes and shoes back, will we?" Mr. Stowe, who had once been quite handsome but now had curled up a bit from years of back-breaking work as a barrier, shook his head. No. Well, that's a waste. Aaron could use them. The shoes, at least. Wish I'd thought to take them before he left. I wouldn't want to wear them, Aaron said, and then he pinched his lips together before he said more. Still, his mother narrowed her eyes and spoke softly, almost fearfully. You'll do well to forget about him. Aaron kept silent for a moment, thinking. You're right, he said finally. It won't happen again. See to it, said Mr. Stowe. After 15 minutes, they had reached Quadrant 4, a residential square mile of tiny, identical houses planted closely together like rows of sweet corn, each house the color of dry, cracked desert that surrounded it. The crowd of people split up and weaved their way between the structures until they reached their own individual homes. Aaron and his parents nodded politely to their neighbors as they walked along. When Aaron saw a familiar couple around the same age as his parents, walking alone, he touched his mother's sleeve. How odd, he said. Isn't Mr. Ranger a milker? Yes, she said. Why is he out and about instead of doing his job? Aaron's eyes narrowed. He must have been given the day off this year because of the unwanted daughter. Did they know in advance, I wonder? She turned to Mr. Stowe. Not that I heard. That's a blow, Mr. Stowe said. He yawned as they neared their house, number 54-43. They'll be cut off from reproducing now. This was their second offense. Mr. Stowe wrinkled his nose. They'll be completely ridiculed by the Wanteds for poor production. Mrs. Stowe gave her husband a disapproving glance. You be careful what you say, she snapped, lest you forget we've a wanted in our presence now. Aaron raised his chin slightly as his parents stood aside at the front door, allowing the boy to enter before them for the first time. Yes, be careful, Father, Aaron said coolly, or I'll have to report your insubordination for a comment like that. Aaron took on a dignified stride as he made his way through the tiny kitchen to the even tinier bedroom that he no longer had to share. It's true, he thought. Enough mourning. Alex has likely been eliminated by now. The twinge in his gut was soon dulled by thoughts of his now secured future and a tiny surge of power. He was Aaron Stowe, the wanted, and he had a lot more to prove than most, having been born of two necessaries, not to mention overcoming the stigma of a worthless twin brother. It was, Aaron knew, a huge accomplishment to have made it to the top like this. He began to pack his suitcase, a satisfying feeling growing inside him, for tonight would be his last night living with his necessary parents. Tomorrow he would go to university to be with the others of his elevated status. Chapter 3. The Death Farm. No one spoke during the 15-minute bus ride to the death farm. It was stiflingly hot. Flies buzzed and darted at the closed windows, unable to escape. When Alex pulled out of his deep daze, he wiped the sweat off his forehead with his upper arm and looked around the bus. In front of Alex, connected to him by a long chain over the high-backed bus seat, was his neighbor and friend, Megan Ranger. It was a bit of a shock to see her in this group. She'd only had one infraction, as far as he knew, but it was a double. Singing and dancing. Alex had witnessed it, but it wasn't he who had reported her. She'd had a pretty voice, too, but Alex was not permitted to think about that. Despite the heat, Megan's face was white as the moon. Across the bus aisle was Samheed Burkish, who was well known to Alex but not necessarily well liked by him. Alex was surprised to see him here, too, since the boy had privately boasted to Alex and Aaron only last week that he was going to be in the Quilitary. Samheed was obviously fighting tears and glared furiously when Alex's eyes landed on him. "What are you looking at?" Samheed said. But one of the younger governors gave Samheed a warning look. Unwanteds were not allowed to speak. Their last words had already been uttered before the purge. Alex dropped his eyes and took in a few breaths, vowing silently not to look at Samheed again until, well, ever. Instead, he turned his gaze to the seat behind his own, not having noted in the shock of it all who was attached to his other arm. He nearly had to stand in order to see over the high seat back to where the chain led, but he didn't, since the governors were watching. All he could see was the straight jet black hair and big watery blue eyes of someone was sure to had been a girl, but a tiny girl for 13, he thought. She didn't turn away. Instead, she held his gaze, blinking away her tears only once during the long moment. Her eyes were deep and soulful, with wet black lashes all clumped together from crying. After a moment, Alex attempted a half-smile. He doubted that she could see his mouth if he couldn't see hers, but her eyes crinkled just at the tiniest bit in response, and for some reason it made Alex feel just a little bit good. There was no one else on the rickety old bus that Alex knew. He thought for a moment about being here alone with the governors, and for some selfish reason he couldn't quite explain, he felt a rush of something glad, knowing that Megan and the others were with him, that he wasn't the only unwanted in the entire land of Quill. The bus chugged past the nursery where all of Quill's trees stood, past the cattle ranch on the way out of town, and along the stark, dingy, gray south wall of Quill for several minutes, before the equally bland houses disappeared and the land grew untended and desolate. Alex's stomach churned when the driver braked and the bus slowly groaned to a stop in front of the black, solid iron gates of what the people of Quill called the Death Farm. None but the High Priest Justine and the governors had ever been inside the gates and returned alive, and they didn't speak of it. Only the people of Quill, in hushed voices, would talk about it now and then, and speculate about how long you might be held there before the Eliminators disposed of you. And just how did they do it? Was it painful? Did they sedate you before tossing you into the great lake of boiling oil? Alex tried hard not to think of these things, but the harder he tried, the more he thought of them. And so it was almost with relief that he heard the bus door creak open and the governors tell all of the Unwanteds to stand and disembark. There was a distinct smell, pungent, when the children walked off the bus and gathered along the black gate that led to the farm. It was an uncommon odor, different from the fried smells that came from the Quillery vehicles. Alex assumed it was burning oil wafting off the lake nearby. He had never been this close to it before, since no one was allowed near it. No one could even see the lake, because the towering cement block walls that surrounded the land reached all the way up to the barbed wire ceiling, 40 feet above. No one, that is, except the Unwanteds. Alex glanced at the black-haired, blue-eyed girl next to him. The protective barbed wire ceiling that crisscrossed and covered the entire land of Quill made a shadow box on her face, capturing a tear. She shook silently. She was not 13, Alex decided. In a brave moment, with nothing to lose, he whispered, "I'm Alex. It'll go quickly." He wasn't sure why he said that. It was the only comforting thing he could think of. She blinked and turned her face up at him, making the shadow boxes race across her face like they did across everything, everywhere. "Lonnie," she whispered back and shook her head. "And no, it won't." Alex didn't know what to say. He stood at attention as the governor took a key from a string around her neck and unlocked the gate. "Summon the Eliminators," the woman said. Another governor obliged by a pounding on the gate. When the enormous gate creaked open, the governor stepped away and began boarding the bus again. Lonnie watched them go, tears streaming down her face. "Goodbye, Father," she said as a slight, gray-haired man boarded. The senior governor paused in the doorway for a split second, and then, perhaps heavily, continued up the steps without looking back. He took a seat on the opposite side of the bus. Lonnie turned away and roughly whisked the tears from her cheeks. The bus drove off as the giant black door to the Death Farm widened enough for the chained children to enter single file. Inside were 4 enormous Eliminators robed in black. Their heads were covered in cloth, but their beady red eyes pierced into the already frightened souls of the children. Lonnie now appeared to be the only calm one. She held her head high as the long chain of children walked inside. "What are they?" Megan gasped and reached awkwardly for Alex's hand. Alex grabbed Megan's hand and gave it a frightened squeeze. "I don't know," he whispered. He felt like his chest was going to collapse, breathing in and out slowly. Alex closed his eyes for a moment and shivered as the gate groaned and closed with a loud clang, the lock clicking automatically to the other side, separating them from Quill forever. The Eliminators took the ends of the chains and trudged slowly, the children following. They were in a small cement yard. A gray stone building stood before them, and a steaming black lake boiled beyond it. Alex shuddered. "That's where they'll do it to us." The oily stench seemed to grow stronger as they shuffled across the broken cement, past bundles of burned-looking weeds, toward the building. It was more desolate than the most wasted section of Quill. Even the sky was clouded and gray here, although there was no barbed wire, just open sky. None of them had ever seen an uninterrupted sky before. Everything was eerily silent but for the clanging of the chains and the scuffle of shoes as the Unwanted moved forward. The seconds felt like hours. When the Eliminators stopped walking and turned their eyes to the sky, Alex followed their gaze. The other children looked up too. From the sky over the boiling black lake, a large bird, or something, slowly approached. The Eliminators seemed to be waiting for it, and they stood, huge, hulking, silent, as a 4-legged winged creature landed with an ominous thud directly in front of them.